double
Hold
doors
on
of
tight,
St.
we're almost
Maron's
there.
emergency room exploded inward at 11 minutes past midnight. Every head in the waiting area turned. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. The ambient noise of the ER, the soft chatter of nurses, the hum of vending machines, the distant beeping of monitors, all of it evaporated in a single breath. A man filled the doorway. Not just stood in it, filled it. He was enormous. 6'3", maybe 6'4", with shoulders wide enough to block the fluorescent light behind him. A leather vest stretched tight across his chest, bearing patches that made the security guard near the intake desk instinctively reach for his radio. Hell's Angels. The words stitched in red and white across the back of that vest carried decades of reputation, of violence, of fear. His arms were covered in tattoos that crawled from his wrists to his neck, faded ink mixed with newer work. Skulls, flames, names in Gothic script. A heavy chain hung from his belt loop to his back pocket, and his boots steel-toed and scarred, left muddy prints on the freshly mopped linoleum as he stormed forward. But none of that is what made the room go silent. It was the girl in his arms. She was small, impossibly small against his massive frame. 8 years old, maybe less, with dark curls matted against her forehead in a face that should have been full of life, but was instead a canvas of bruises. Purple and blue and sickly yellow layered like a terrible painting no one would ever hang. Her clothes were smeared with blood, some dried to rust along the seams, some still glistening wet under the harsh lights. One of her arms hung at an angle that wasn't right, wasn't natural. A scrape ran along her jawline, raw and angry. Her eyes were closed and her body was limp in the way that makes a parent's blood turn to ice. The kind of limp that isn't sleep. The kind that suggests the body has checked out, gone somewhere, deep and unreachable, to escape what's happening on the surface. The man held her the way you hold something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. Cradled against his chest, her head tucked under his chin, his arms forming a cage of leather and muscle and bone around her small body, as if he could protect her from whatever had already happened by sheer force of will, as if holding tight enough could undo the damage. "Help her!" His voice cracked through the silence like a gunshot. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a demand. It was something more primal than that. Something raw and desperate that came from a place deeper than words. "Somebody help my little girl." For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. Then Colleen Ferris moved on. She was already on her feet before she fully registered what was happening. 15 years in this emergency room had wired certain reflexes into her body that bypassed conscious thought entirely. She saw a child in distress. She moved. It was that simple, that automatic. "Gurney," she shouted, her voice cutting through the frozen room like a blade. "I need a gurney here now." The spell broke. White coats and blue scrubs surged forward. A young orderly sprinted down the hallway, wheels rattling as he pushed the gurney at full speed. 2 nurses flanked Colleen as she approached the man, their sneakers squeaking against the polished floor in urgent rhythm. Colleen looked up at the man's face. Past the beard, past the scars, past the tattoo of a spider web that crept up the side of his neck. She looked directly into his eyes. What she saw there stopped her for half a heartbeat. Terror, pure, unfiltered terror. The kind that strips away everything a person has built around themselves. Every wall, every mask, every carefully constructed exterior, and leaves nothing but the raw, trembling core of who they really are. This man, this mountain of leather and ink and reputation, was shaking. "Sir," Colleen said, her voice shifting to the calm, steady tone she'd perfected over a decade and a half of nights exactly like this one. "We're going to take care of her. I need you to lay her down on the gurney. Gently." He hesitated. His arms tightened around the girl, pulling her closer to his chest. It was involuntary, she could tell. The primal resistance of a parent being asked to release their child into unknown hands. "She's safe with us," Colleen said. Not a promise. Promises were dangerous in emergency rooms, but a statement delivered with enough conviction to matter. Something in her voice reached him. His jaw unclenched just barely, and he stepped forward. With a tenderness that seemed impossible for hands that large, that scarred, that tattooed, he lowered the girl onto the white sheets of the gurney. His fingers lingered on her small hand for a moment before he forced himself to let go. The medical team closed around the girl like a wave. Colleen's hands moved with practiced precision, checking vitals, assessing injuries, calling out numbers. and instructions in the coded language of emergency medicine. The girl's pulse was weak but steady. Her breathing was shallow. The bruising extended beyond her face, down her neck, across her arms. "Get Dr. Linden," Colleen said to the nurse beside her, "and prep trauma too." The gurney was already moving, pushed by hands that knew every turn of these corridors by heart. The man stood where they'd left him, rooted. His arms hung empty at his sides, still curved in the shape of the girl he'd been holding. Blood stained his leather vest, his jeans, his hands. The harsh overhead lights made him look older than he probably was, carving deep shadows into the lines around his eyes and mouth. He watched the gurney disappear through the swinging doors of the trauma wing. The doors flapped once, twice, then settled, and just like that, she was gone from his sight. Colleen glanced back as she followed the gurney. She saw his legs give slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to betray the effort it took to remain standing. He staggered sideways and found a wall, pressed his back against it, slid down until he was almost sitting, his massive frame folded in on itself like something deflating. She filed the image away in her mind. She would come back to it later. Right now, the girl needed her. The man could wait. His name was Garrett Harlan. The nurses would learn this from his driver's license when they finally convinced him to provide identification. But in those first hours, he was simply the man in the leather vest. The Hell's Angel with the injured girl. The figure hunched in the plastic chair of the waiting room, making the furniture look like it belonged in a dollhouse. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. His fingers, thick and scarred across the knuckles, were laced through hair that was more gray than brown. The skull ring on his right hand caught the fluorescent light every time his hands trembled, which was often. The waiting room had cleared, not because visiting hours were over, because people had taken one look at the man in the Hell's Angels vest and decided their ailments could wait, or at least be treated somewhere else. An elderly woman with a cough had relocated to the far corner. A young couple with a sick toddler had moved to chairs near the exit, casting nervous glances his way. Garrett noticed none of it. His eyes were locked on the double doors that led to the trauma wing, fixed on them with an intensity that could have burned through steel. Every time those doors opened, his whole body tensed. Every time a nurse or doctor emerged who wasn't heading toward him, his shoulders dropped another fraction of an inch. Time moved differently in waiting rooms. Anyone who has ever sat in one knows this. Minutes stretch into something elastic and cruel, bending under the weight of uncertainty until each second feels like it carries the mass of an hour. For Garrett Harlan, sitting in that plastic chair, with his daughter's blood drying on his hands, time had stopped entirely. His mind would not be still. Every few seconds, his eyes darted to the double doors, then back to his hands, then to the clock on the wall, whose second hand moved with a cruelty that felt personal, then back to the doors. The pattern repeated, a loop of anxiety that wore grooves in his consciousness, the way his boots had been wearing grooves in the linoleum during the moments when sitting became unbearable, and he had to pace. His leather vest felt heavier than it had in years. The patches, the symbols, the embroidered letters that spelled out an identity he'd been trying to shed, they pressed against his shoulders like hands pushing him down. In this place, under these lights, surrounded by people in clean scrubs and white coats, the vest was a neon sign that broadcast a single message: danger, criminal, guilty. He tried to take it off once years ago, stuffed it in a trash bag and shoved it in the back of his closet. But Nora had found it during a game of hide and seek, pulled it out, held it up with both hands like a flag, and asked what it was. He'd told her it was from a long time ago, from before. She'd nodded the way children nod when they accept answers they don't fully understand, and she'd never asked again. But he'd kept the vest, not out of pride, out of honesty. You can't outrun what you were by pretending it didn't exist. Now, sitting in this hospital with his daughter's blood drying on that vest, he wondered if keeping it had been his biggest mistake. The memories came without permission. They always did, dragging him backward through doors he'd spent years trying to nail shut. Vivid and uninvited, they projected against the blank screen of his terror like a film he couldn't pause. A small apartment in Bridgeport. Not much to look at from the outside. Peeling paint on the window frames, a front door that stuck when it rained, a landlord who fixed things on his own timeline, which meant never. But inside, the apartment smelled of coffee and motor oil, and those two scents mixed together had become the smell of home. Sunlight came through thin curtains in the living room. It caught the dust motes that drifted in the air, turning them into tiny golden satellites orbiting nothing. And there in the center of that small universe, Garrett sat in a worn armchair with his daughter in his arms. She was 3 years old then. 3 years old and 22 pounds, and the most important thing in the known world. Her name was Nora. She had dark curls that tickled his chin when she leaned against his chest and tiny fingers that traced the tattoos on his forearms like she was reading a map to somewhere only she could see. On the wall across from them hung a photograph in a slightly crooked frame. A woman's face. Young, beautiful. Brown eyes that held a warmth you could feel even through glass and paper and time. She was smiling the way people smile when joy catches them off guard, when it arrives so completely that there's no room for anything else. The photograph was taken the day Nora was born. The woman in it, Jessie, was holding their daughter for the first time. Her hair was a mess and her hospital gown was wrinkled, and she had never looked more radiant. The frame was crooked. It had been crooked since the day Garrett hung it, and he'd never straightened it. Something about its imperfection felt honest, felt real, felt like Jessie. "Daddy?" Nora's voice was soft with approaching sleep, her small hand patting his cheek. "Tell me about Mommy again." Garrett shifted in the chair, adjusting her so she could see the photograph. He did this every night. The same story, the same words, the same quiet ritual that held their small family together across the divide between the living and the gone. "Your mommy," he began, his voice careful and low, the voice of a man who understood that some words were too precious to rush, had the prettiest smile in the whole world, just like yours, Princess. Nora's eyes, heavy with sleep, drifted to the photograph. "She's watching us, right, you ate baby girl. Always." He pulled her closer, breathing in the clean scent of her shampoo, feeling the impossible lightness of her against his chest. "I promise you, Nora, I'll never let anything happen to you. You're my whole world." He meant it. God help him, he meant it more than he had ever meant anything. The memory dissolved. It didn't fade gently. It fractured like glass hit by a stone, and the pieces rearranged themselves into something darker. 6 months after that night in the apartment, the same hospital where Garrett now sat. Different floor, different wing, but the same fluorescent lights, the same antiseptic smell, the same feeling of the world tilting on its axis and refusing to right itself. Nora was sleeping in a plastic chair. She was still so small. Her legs didn't reach the floor, and her head was tilted at an angle that would give her a stiff neck in the morning, but Garrett couldn't bring himself to wake her. Couldn't bring himself to do anything except stand in that hallway and watch the doctor walk toward him. The doctor wore green scrubs. His face was grave. Not the theatrical gravity of a man delivering rehearsed bad news, but the genuine weight of someone who understood that the words he was about to speak would rearrange another human being's life. "Mr. Harlan," Garrett already knew. He could read it in the way the doctor's shoulders slumped slightly, in the way his eyes didn't quite meet Garrett's, in the way his hands held the clipboard, not like a professional tool, but like something to anchor himself to. Jessie was gone. A simple drive to the grocery store. That was all. Bread and milk, and maybe some of those cookies Nora liked. A routine trip on a Tuesday afternoon that ended in screeching tires and twisted metal, and a silence that would echo through the rest of Garrett Harlan's life. His legs gave out. He didn't fall so much as descend, sliding down the wall to the cold hospital floor with his back pressed against the painted cinder block. His leather vest creaked as he bent forward, hands covering his face. The skull ring pressed cold against his cheek. He sat on that floor for 20 minutes, maybe longer. Time had stopped mattering. A janitor mopped around him without saying a word. A nurse brought him water that he didn't drink. Nora slept on in her plastic chair, her small body curled into itself, her thumb resting near her mouth the way it did when dreams came hard and she needed comfort she couldn't name. The thought that filled his mind was not grief, not yet. Grief would come later in waves that nearly drowned him in 3 o'clock mornings, when the apartment was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat and wished he couldn't. The thought that filled his mind in that moment on the hospital floor was a question. How do I do this alone? How do I raise Nora without Jessie? He looked at his daughter sleeping in that chair. So small, so unaware. In a few hours he would have to wake her. He would have to find words to explain that Mommy wasn't coming home. That the woman in the crooked photograph, the woman with the brightest smile in the world, had gone somewhere they couldn't follow. He would have to hold his daughter while she cried and somehow, through his own breaking, convince her that everything would be all right. He had never felt so inadequate in his life. Not during the worst nights with the angels. Not during the fights that left him bleeding in alleys. Not during the years of decisions he could never undo. None of that had made him feel as small and helpless as the thought of telling his 4-year-old daughter that her mother was dead. The answer, when it finally came to him months later, was simple. He would change. He would become someone different, someone better, someone worthy of the promise he'd made in that apartment with the crooked picture frame and the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. And he did change, or at least he tried. The memory shifted again. Faster this time, blurring like watercolors in rain, reassembling into a crisp autumn afternoon several years later. Garrett stood outside Nora's school. He still wore his Hell's Angels vest, but he carried himself differently now. The leather felt more like a skin he was slowly shedding than armor he was proud to wear. He distanced himself from the dangerous aspects of club life. No more midnight rides to places he couldn't talk about. No more envelopes passed under tables. No more phone calls that made his jaw clench and his fist tighten. He worked at a motorcycle repair shop now. Legitimate work that paid legitimate money. He showed up at 7 every morning, hands already calloused from the day before, and he worked until 5. Then he picked up Nora from her after-school program, drove her homemade dinner, which usually involved something from a box because cooking had been Jesse's department and the learning curve was steep, helped with homework. Read her a story and fell asleep in the armchair while she slept in the bedroom down the hall. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting. It was by every measurable standard in ordinary life. And Garrett guarded that ordinariness the way he'd once guarded things he was now ashamed to name, because he understood in a way that only people who've lived outside the lines can understand that ordinary is a privilege, that the boring rhythms of school pickups and grocery runs and bedtime stories are not the opposite of living. They are the entire point of it. The yellow school bus rounded the corner with a squeal of brakes. The doors folded open and 8-year-old Nora bounded down the steps, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her dark curls, so like Jesse's, streamed behind her as she ran toward him. She wore a denim jacket he'd bought her for her last birthday, decorated with the butterfly patches she'd chosen herself at the craft store, each one applied with the serious concentration of a surgeon. "Daddy," she called out, and the word carried across the distance between them like sunlight breaking through clouds. Other parents milled around the pickup area. Some cast glances at Garrett, the kind of glances people cast when they see tattoos and leather and patches they recognize from news reports and crime documentaries. The kind of glances that measure and judge and find wanting all in the space of a heartbeat. A mother pulled her son a little closer. A father looked away a little too quickly. Garrett barely noticed. His entire world was running toward him with butterfly patches on her jacket and a smile that could have powered every light in the city. She crashed into his legs with the force of a small, joyful missile. He lifted her easily, her backpack dangling, her arms wrapping around his neck. "How was school, princess?" "We learned about butterflies today. Did you know they can taste with their feet?" "Can they now?" "Mrs. Palmer said so. And guess what? I got a star on my spelling test." "That's my girl." He set her down and she took his hand, her small fingers wrapped around two of his, which was all she could manage given the size difference. They walked together toward their car, and Nora talked without pausing for breath about butterflies and spelling and a boy named Tyler who ate glue during art class. In that moment, walking through an autumn afternoon with his daughter's hand in his, Garrett Harlan, and felt something he had almost forgotten existed. Peace. The memories released him with a jolt. The waiting room materialized around him again, harsh and bright and smelling of antiseptic. The plastic chair, the fluorescent lights, the distant beeping of machines keeping unknown people alive behind closed doors. His daughter was behind one of those doors, not talking about butterflies, not showing him spelling tests, lying unconscious with bruises that covered her like a map of suffering. Footsteps approached, measured, deliberate footsteps that belonged to someone who had walked these corridors thousands of times. Dr. Linden emerged from the trauma wing. He was still wearing his surgical cap, his mask pulled down around his neck. His face carried the expression of a man who had something difficult to say and had not yet decided exactly how to say it. Behind him, the double doors settled into stillness. Garrett was on his feet before the doctor had taken 3 steps, rising from that plastic chair like something pulled upward by an invisible wire. "Mr. Harlan," the doctor said. His voice was carefully neutral, deliberately stripped of emotion the way doctors learn to speak when the news is complicated. "Is she okay?" Garrett's voice came out wrong, too loud, too desperate. He tried to modulate it and failed. "We've stabilized Nora. Her vital signs are steady, and the immediate injuries from the accident are being treated. She's going to need time, but the acute danger has passed." Relief flooded through Garrett so hard, his knees nearly buckled again. He reached for the wall, steadied himself. "But there's something else we need to discuss." The relief froze, turned solid in his chest like water becoming ice. Dr. Linden reached into a folder he'd been carrying and withdrew several X-ray films. He held them up against the light from the ceiling, and the images glowed with the ghostly blue-white of bone and shadow. "These dark areas here." The doctor pointed to several spots on the images. His finger moved with clinical precision, but his eyes were watching Garrett's face. "These show fractures that occurred weeks ago, and these," he indicated other areas further along the arm near the ribs. "These are much older. Some of these injuries have healed improperly, which tells us they were never treated by a medical professional." The hallway seemed to narrow. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, or maybe that was the blood rushing in Garrett's ears. "Mr. Harlan," the doctor continued. His voice had shifted, still professional but harder now, a foundation of steel beneath the calm. "As medical professionals, we are required by law to report suspected abuse. These injuries are consistent with patterns we typically see in cases of repeated physical trauma to a child." The words hit Garrett like a freight train. "I didn't do this." His voice cracked on the last word. He shook his head, took a step backward, then another, as if physical distance could separate him from what was being implied. "I swear to God I didn't do this. I would never hurt Nora. Never." His hands were shaking, trembling so badly that the chains on his vest rattled softly, a small metallic sound that seemed obscenely loud in the quiet corridor. Dr. Linden's expression didn't change. He'd heard denials before. Every doctor in every emergency room in every city in America has heard denials before. The words "I would never" are spoken so often in these corridors that they've lost their currency. They buy nothing. They convince no one. "Sir," the doctor said, "the evidence suggests a pattern of injuries sustained over an extended period. The healing stages are inconsistent with a single incident. There are fractures in various stages of recovery, bruising that ranges from recent to weeks old." "And you don't understand." Garrett's tough exterior was crumbling. Not slowly, not in pieces, but all at once, like a dam giving way. "She's my little girl. She's my whole world. I would die before I'd hurt her." His eyes were wet, red-rimmed and glistening under the harsh lights. But he would not let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of this doctor who was looking at him the way everyone always looked at him, seeing the vest and the tattoos and the scars, and deciding in the space of a heartbeat who he was. 2 security guards appeared at the far end of the hallway. They stood with their hands on their belts, watching the scene unfold with the practiced readiness of men who had been summoned for situations exactly like this one. The whispers from the nurses' station had stopped entirely. The silence that replaced them was worse. "Mr. Harlan," Dr. Linden said, "until we complete our investigation, we're going to need to restrict your access to your daughter." The word "restrict" detonated in Garrett's chest like a bomb buried deep. "Wait," the voice came from behind the doctor, clear, firm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. Colleen Ferris stepped forward. She had been standing near the nurse's station, close enough to hear everything, close enough to watch Garrett's face as the doctor delivered each blow, close enough to see the details that Dr. Linden focused on his X-rays and his protocols had missed. "I need to say something," she said. Every eye in the corridor turned to her. Dr. Linden, his X-rays still held against the light. The security guards, their hands resting on their belts. The nurses at their station frozen mid-task. And Garrett, whose entire future seemed to hang by a thread so thin it was invisible. Colleen met the doctor's gaze. Her scrubs were slightly wrinkled from the long shift. There was a coffee stain on her left sleeve that she hadn't noticed yet. But her eyes were clear and steady, and her voice when she spoke carried the weight of 15 years spent in this exact emergency room, watching people at their very worst, and learning through experience no textbook could provide to see what others missed. Doctor, I've been observing Mr. Harlan since the moment he arrived. Dr. Linden frowned. Nurse Ferris, with all due respect, this is a medical and legal matter that requires... I've seen how he looks at his daughter, Colleen continued, not raising her voice but not yielding either. I've seen how he held her when he carried her in. I've seen how his hands shook when he had to let her go. She paused. The corridor was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights sounded like a choir. When Nora was semi-conscious during the initial assessment, she reached for his hand. She didn't flinch when he touched her. She didn't recoil. She reached for him. She wanted him close. Colleen looked at Dr. Linden the way one professional looks at another when they are about to stake their reputation on a statement. I've worked in this ER for 15 years. I've seen real abuse cases. I've seen the fear in children's eyes when their abusers are near. The way their bodies tense, the way they turn away, the involuntary flinch when a hand reaches toward them. She took a breath. That is not what I saw tonight. Something else is going on here, and I think we owe it to that little girl to find out what it is before we make decisions that could destroy the only family she has. The corridor held its breath. Dr. Linden looked at Colleen for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly the way it did when he was weighing options, measuring risks, calculating the distance between protocol and judgment. He glanced at the x-rays still in his hand, then at Garrett, then back at Colleen. Behind them, the two security guards exchanged a look. One of them shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The fluorescent light above them flickered once a tiny imperfection in the building's nervous system and then held steady. I appreciate your observation, Nurse Ferris, he said finally. But we still have a legal obligation to report and investigate. I'll note your comments in the file. It was the smallest of concessions. A crack in a wall, not a door thrown open. But Colleen knew what it meant. It meant time. Not much, but some. And in situations like this, time was the difference between a system that investigated and a system that demolished. Dr. Linden turned back to Garrett. Mr. Harlan, we won't restrict your access entirely, but you will remain in the waiting area while we complete our preliminary assessment. A social worker will be contacted. I suggest you cooperate fully. The doctor walked away, his shoes clicking against the floor with the rhythm of a man who had said what he needed to say and was moving on to the next crisis. He paused once at the nurse's station, spoke quietly to the charge nurse, made a note on a chart, and disappeared around the corner. The security guards remained, but they eased back, leaned against the wall instead of standing at attention. The tension in the corridor dropped by a single degree, not enough to breathe easy, but enough to breathe. Garrett stood motionless. His eyes were fixed on Colleen. She'd just done something no one had done for him in as long as he could remember. She'd stood between him and the machinery of a system that had already made up its mind. She'd put her professional credibility on the line for a man she didn't know, a man whose appearance screamed every warning sign the textbooks had ever cataloged. Why? The word left his mouth before he could stop it. Raw, confused, barely audible. Colleen looked at him, really looked, past the vest and the tattoos and the chains and the scars, past all of it to the man underneath, the man with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands and a daughter's blood drying on his clothes. Because I've been wrong about people before, she said quietly, and because I've had people be wrong about me. She didn't explain what she meant, didn't elaborate, didn't offer her history as a gift or a bond or a bridge. She simply stated a fact and let it stand on its own. Your daughter's name is Nora, she said. He nodded. Nora is in good hands, Mr. Harlan. The best hands in this hospital. Whatever happens next, she's being taken care of right now. That's what matters right now. Colleen turned and walked back toward the trauma wing. Her white sneakers made soft sounds against the linoleum. At the double doors, she paused and looked back. There's coffee in the family waiting room down the hall. It's terrible, but it's hot. Then she was gone through the doors, back to the world of monitors and IV lines and the small bruised girl who needed her. Garrett stood alone in the corridor. The security guards watched him from their post. The nurses at their station pretended to be busy with charts and screens. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant tuneless song. He walked to the waiting room she'd mentioned, found the coffee machine, poured a cup with hands that still wouldn't stop shaking. The coffee was exactly as terrible as she'd promised. He sat down in another plastic chair, this one slightly more comfortable than the last, though comfort was a relative concept when your daughter lay unconscious in a trauma room, and the world seemed determined to convince itself that you were the reason she was there. From where he sat, he could see the double doors of the trauma wing through a narrow window in the wall. He fixed his eyes on those doors, and he waited. Colleen Ferris knew what it was like to be judged by the worst version of yourself. She didn't think about it often. She'd built walls around that part of her life, strong walls reinforced with years of hard work and harder choices. But sometimes in moments like this one, the walls became transparent, and she could see right through them to the woman she used to be. 10 years ago, she had been the one on the gurney. Not in a leather vest, not with tattoos and chains, but just as broken, just as judged, just as trapped by a past that had sunk its teeth into her and wouldn't let go. It started the way these things always start, with something small, something that seemed harmless, even helpful. After her husband Declan died, the grief had been a physical thing, a weight on her chest that made breathing feel like labor, a darkness behind her eyes that turned sleep into something she dreaded rather than craved. The doctor gave her pills, just to help you through the worst of it, he'd said. And for a while they did help. They softened the edges of the world, made the pain manageable, turned the roar of grief into a dull hum she could almost ignore. But the worst of it didn't end, and the pills stopped softening the edges and started becoming the edges. She needed more, then more, then more, then more. The progression was so gradual, so seamless, that by the time she realized what was happening, she was already gone, lost, falling through a life that dissolved around her like paper in water. She lost her job first, then her apartment, then her family's trust, which was the loss that cut deepest because trust once broken heals crooked, like a bone that was never set properly, like the fractures on Nora Harlan's x-rays. Her rock bottom had a specific location, room 14 of this very emergency room. She'd arrived by ambulance unconscious, her heart working overtime to process what she'd put into her body. When she woke up, the world was blurry and bright and full of faces that looked at her with the same expression she'd seen directed at Garrett Harlan tonight. Pity mixed with judgment, concern laced with dismissal. The look that says, "We see what you are, and we've already decided what that means." Her own mother had refused to visit. Her sister had come once, stood at the foot of the bed for 3 minutes without speaking, then left. Her colleagues at the dental office, where she'd worked as a receptionist, had sent a card that said, "Get well soon," and was signed by people she'd considered friends, and the card felt like a door closing. But one nurse had looked at her differently, an older woman named Ruthie with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, who sat beside her bed on a Tuesday morning and said words that Colleen had carried with her every single day since. "You're more than the worst thing you've ever done, but you have to be the one who proves it." That nurse was retired now, living in a small house in Vermont with 2 cats and a garden. Colleen sent her a card every Christmas. Every single Christmas without exception, because some debts can never be fully repaid, only honored. Colleen became a nurse because of that woman, because someone gave her a second chance when the world had decided she didn't deserve one from, and she'd spent the last 15 years trying to pass that forward, one patient at a time, one night at a time, one impossible situation at a time. Tonight, standing in that corridor, watching a man in a Hell's Angels vest, being told that the system had already decided who he was and what he'd done, Colleen had felt something shift inside her, something that recognized something. One broken thing, seeing another and knowing with a certainty that bypassed logic and went straight to the marrow that the story being told about this man was wrong. She couldn't prove it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she'd watched Garrett Harlan carry his daughter through those doors, and she'd seen his face when he had to let go, and she'd heard his voice when he said Nora's name. That wasn't the voice of a man who hurts children. That was the voice of a man who would burn the world down to keep one safe. Back in the trauma room, Colleen checked Nora's vitals for the third time. The girl was stable, sedated but stable. Her small chest rose and fell with the mechanical rhythm of assisted breathing, and the monitors traced their green lines across the screens in patterns that for now held steady. Colleen adjusted the blanket around Nora's shoulders, brushed a dark curl from her forehead. The girl's face, even in unconsciousness, even beneath the bruises, carried a softness that made Colleen's chest tighten. 8 years old. Butterfly patches on a denim jacket that had been carefully folded and placed on a chair in the corner by one of the intake nurses. Colleen had noticed the jacket when they'd changed Nora into a hospital gown. Each butterfly patch had been applied with obvious care, some slightly crooked, some overlapping, all chosen with the specific intention of a child who knew exactly what she wanted her jacket to look like. There was a small stain on the left sleeve that looked like grape juice, a loose thread on the hem that someone had tried to tuck in rather than cut. The jacket was loved, worn often, worn proudly. These were the details that mattered, not the ones in the police reports, not the ones on the x-rays, the details that told the real story of a life. The grape juice and the loose thread and the butterflies placed with care by small hands. Through the small window in the door, Colleen could see the corridor. And through the corridor, through the narrow glass panel in the waiting room wall, she could just make out the shape of Garrett Harlan. Still sitting, still watching, still waiting. His hands were wrapped around a paper coffee cup. His eyes were fixed on the doors. He hadn't moved. Around her, the hospital hummed with its nighttime rhythms. Nurses changed shifts. Monitors beeped. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang 3 times and stopped. The building breathed with the slow, steady respiration of a place that never fully sleeps. Colleen looked at Nora, looked at the bruises, looked at the x-rays pinned to the light board on the wall showing fractures in various stages of healing, old injuries layered beneath new ones, a history of pain written in bone. Then she looked through the window at the man in the waiting room. Something was wrong with this picture. The injuries were real. The x-rays didn't lie. Bones had been broken and left to heal on their own without treatment, without care. That was fact. That was evidence. That was the kind of thing that triggered protocols and phone calls and investigations that tore families apart. But the man in that waiting room, the way he'd held his daughter, the way his voice had broken when he said her name, the way his hands had trembled, not with rage, not with the coiled energy of violence, but with the helpless terror of a parent watching their child suffer and being powerless to stop it. Those things were real too. Colleen had seen abusers in this ER, more than she could count. She knew what they looked like when they sat in waiting rooms. The controlled calm, the rehearsed concern, the eyes that calculated rather than grieved, the stories that were too smooth, too polished, too ready. Garrett Harlan was none of those things. He was raw, unguarded, completely catastrophically honest in his terror. Colleen didn't know what the truth was. Not yet. But she knew with the certainty of 15 years and 10,000 patients that the obvious answer was not the right one. She looked at Nora's sleeping face one more time, made a note in her chart, checked the IV drip. Then she walked to the door, stepped into the corridor, and headed toward the waiting room, not to comfort Garrett Harlan, not to befriend him or counsel him or save him, to watch, to listen, to understand. Because something was wrong with this picture, and Colleen Ferris was not the kind of woman who could walk away from a wrong picture. Not anymore. She found him exactly where she'd left him. Same chair, same posture, same fixed stare at the double doors. The coffee cup in his hands was empty, crushed slightly where his grip had tightened around it. "She's stable," Colleen said, settling into a chair across from him. Not next to him, across, maintaining the professional distance that the situation required. Garrett looked up. The relief that washed across his face was so naked, so unguarded, that it would have been uncomfortable to witness if it weren't so clearly genuine. "When can I see her?" "Soon. They're finishing up some tests. The doctor will let you know." He nodded, looked down at the crushed cup in his hands. Then without preamble, without the kind of lead-in that people use when they're about to share something painful, he spoke. "Her name's Nora. She's 8. She likes butterflies and spelling tests and this stuffed bear she's had since she was born." He paused. "Her mom's name was Jessie. She died 4 years ago. Car accident. Just went to get groceries and never came home." He said it the way people say things they've said many times before, but that still costs something every time. "I'm all she's got," he said, "and she's all I've got. That's the whole story. That's everything." Colleen listened. She didn't nod sympathetically, didn't offer platitudes, didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," because she'd heard those words directed at herself enough times to know how hollow they could sound. She just listened, and she watched his hands. The way they held the crushed cup gentle, even in their destruction of it. The tattoo on his neck partially hidden by his collar, a small heart with the name Nora written inside it in delicate script. She filed this away too. "The doctors are going to have questions," she said. "Not a warning, an observation, a preparation. A social worker will be involved. It's going to feel like everyone is working against you." "They already are," Garrett said. His voice carried no self-pity, just exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of a man who has been swimming against a current for so long that he's forgotten what it feels like to stand on solid ground. "No," Colleen said. "Not everyone." She stood up, straightened her scrubs, looked at him one more time long enough for the words to land short enough to maintain the boundary she needed to maintain. "I'll come back when there's news." She walked away, back to the nurse's station, back to her charts and her rounds and the steady rhythm of a shift that was far from over. Her sneakers squeaked softly on the linoleum, a sound so familiar it had become the percussion of her life. At the station, she picked up Nora's chart and began reviewing the notes from the trauma team, making annotations in the margins, flagging items for follow-up. Her handwriting was neat and small, the handwriting of a woman who had learned that precision matters, that details save lives, that the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong often comes down to a single observation recorded at the right time. She did not look back toward the waiting room, but she was aware with the peripheral consciousness that experienced nurses develop the way experienced sailors develop a sense for weather, that Garrett Harlan had not moved. Behind her in that waiting room, Garrett sat in his plastic chair in his blood-stained vest, in the harsh light of a hospital that had already begun to judge him. But for the first time since he'd burst through those double doors with his daughter in his arms, the weight on his chest shifted slightly. Not lifted, not gone, but shifted, redistributed, as if some small portion of it had been picked up by someone else's hands. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and pulled out a photograph, creased and worn at the edges, soft from years of handling. Nora on her last birthday grinning at the camera with a gap-toothed smile hugging a stuffed bear that was almost as big as she was. Jesse's eyes looked out from Nora's face, the same warmth, the same brightness, the same capacity for joy that made the world feel less heavy. He held the photograph carefully, the way you hold something you can't afford to lose. He looked through the narrow window toward the trauma wing. Nora was in there, alive, breathing, being cared for by hands that knew what they were doing. And somewhere in those corridors, a nurse with a coffee stain on her sleeve had looked at him, really looked at him, and had not turned away. It wasn't much. But in the mathematics of desperation, where hope is measured in fractions so small they barely register, it was enough. It was enough to keep him in that chair, enough to keep him waiting, enough to keep him believing that the story of this night was not yet finished being told. The clock on the wall ticked past 2 in the morning. The hospital settled into its deepest quiet, that strange suspended stillness that exists only in the small hours when the world outside has gone dark and the world inside runs on machines and caffeine and the stubborn refusal of certain people to stop caring. A janitor pushed his mop down a distant hallway, the rhythmic swish the only sound besides the monitors. A vending machine hummed in the corner, its display casting a faint blue glow across the empty chairs. Outside the windows, the parking lot was a sea of black asphalt dotted with sodium yellow pools of light. No one came. No one left. The hospital breathed in and out, patient and steady, like something alive and ancient that had seen 1,000 nights exactly like this one. And Garrett Harlan waited for his daughter, his hands still trembling, his heart still beating, his eyes still fixed on the doors that separated him from the only thing in the world that mattered. The photograph of Nora pressed against his chest, tucked back into his vest pocket, resting over his heart like a talisman. He did not know what the morning would bring. He did not know that a social worker in a charcoal suit was already being called. He did not know that his brother's voice would soon crackle through his phone with threats wrapped in false warmth. He did not know that the woman in the wrinkled scrubs who had stood up for him tonight would become the difference between keeping his daughter and losing her forever. He knew only this: Nora was alive. Nora was breathing, and he would sit in this chair until his body gave out or someone physically removed him, because that is what fathers do. They wait, they endure, they refuse to leave. The fluorescent lights hummed, the monitors beeped, and somewhere behind those double doors, a little girl with butterfly patches on her jacket and her mother's eyes slept on, unaware of the storm that was gathering around the only family she had left. The storm arrived at 7:14 in the morning, wearing a charcoal suit and sensible heels. Colleen saw her first. She was refilling her coffee at the nurse's station, running on 4 hours of sleep, snatched in the break room between rounds, when the elevator doors opened at the far end of the corridor. The woman who stepped out moved with the particular kind of purpose that Colleen had learned to recognize over the years. Not the hurried stride of a worried family member, not the measured pace of a doctor on rounds. This was the walk of someone who represented an institution, someone who carried paperwork the way soldiers carry weapons. She was mid-40s, trim with auburn hair, pulled back in a clip that meant business. Her badge caught the fluorescent light as she approached the nurse's station, and Colleen read the name before the woman had a chance to introduce herself. Karen Pritchard, Child Protective Services. Colleen set down her coffee. Ms. Pritchard stopped at the station, consulted her tablet briefly, then looked up with the practiced smile of a person whose job required her to deliver difficult things while appearing reasonable. "I'm looking for the attending nurse on the Harlan case," she said. "The girl admitted last night. Multiple injuries." "That would be me," Colleen said. "Colleen Ferris." Pritchard's eyes moved over Colleen quickly, the way eyes move when they're cataloging rather than connecting. Then she nodded. "And where is Mr. Harlan?" Colleen gestured down the corridor toward the family waiting room. "He's been there all night." Pritchard followed her gaze. Through the window, Garrett was visible in his plastic chair. He'd moved at some point during the early hours Colleen had noticed, shifting from one chair to another, pacing, sitting, pacing again. But he'd never gone further than the vending machine and back. His leather vest was rumpled, his beard unkempt, and even from a distance, the dark circles under his eyes were visible like bruises of their own. Pritchard studied him for a moment. Her expression didn't change, but Colleen saw something settle behind her eyes. A decision being made, a category being assigned. "I'll need to speak with him," Pritchard said, tucking her tablet under her arm. "And I'll need access to the girl's medical records." "Dr. Linden can authorize that," Colleen replied. "I'll page him." Pritchard was already walking toward the waiting room. Her heels clicked against the linoleum with the rhythm of a countdown. Colleen watched her go. Then she picked up the phone and paged Dr. Linden. Then she picked up her coffee, took a long sip, and followed at a distance that was close enough to hear, but far enough to maintain the appearance of simply going about her rounds. She had a feeling she was going to need to hear this. Garrett saw Pritchard coming before she reached the waiting room doorway. Colleen watched his body react to the woman's approach the way a weather vane reacts to a shifting wind. His shoulders squared, his jaw set, his hands, which had been resting on his knees, curled slowly into fists and then deliberately uncurled. He knew what was coming, maybe not the specifics, but the shape of it. The feeling of institutional weight being brought to bear. "Mr. Harlan," Pritchard's voice was crisp and professional as she entered the room. She did not extend her hand. "I'm Karen Pritchard from Child Protective Services. I've been assigned to your daughter's case." Garrett stood. The movement was automatic, ingrained. When someone walks into a room to determine your future, you stand. You face it on your feet. His massive frame towered over Pritchard, but she didn't flinch. She'd stood in rooms with men larger than Garrett before. Size didn't intimidate her. Her weapons were different. "My daughter is being treated for injuries from a motorcycle accident," Garrett said. His voice was controlled, but Colleen could hear the strain beneath it, like a cable pulled too tight. "That's partly why I'm here," Pritchard said, consulting in her tablet. She scrolled through information, and Colleen noticed how her eyes moved quick and selective, picking out the pieces that supported the picture she was already assembling. "The accident explains some of the injuries, but the X-rays tell a different story, don't they, Mr. Harlan?" Garrett's jaw worked. "I've already told the doctor. I didn't hurt my daughter." "Of course," Pritchard's tone remained neutral, not agreeing, not disagreeing, simply receiving information and filing it in whatever system operated behind those careful eyes. "But my job requires me to look at the full picture. Your background, your living situation, Nora's history." She tapped the tablet, read from it with the detached precision of a woman reading a grocery list. "Garrett Harlan, also known as Sledge, former member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, Hartford chapter. Multiple arrests between the ages of 19 and 32. Assault, possession with intent, conspiracy to commit. One conviction served 18 months at Cheshire Correctional. Each item landed like a stone dropped into still water. Colleen watched Garrett absorb them. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes dimmed with each one. The slow extinguishing of a man watching his past be read back to him in a tone that left no room for context or change or the years of effort that separated who he was from who he'd been. Nora's school attendance records show frequent absences over the past year. Pritchard continued, no stable employment history on file, single-parent household in a low-income neighborhood with documented gang activity. Former gang activity, Garrett said, and his voice cracked on the word former, like it was a bone breaking. I left that life behind. Years ago. For Nora. Pritchard looked up from her tablet, studied his face, the tattoos, the vest, the scars on his knuckles, everything that the eye could see and the assumptions that flowed from seeing. Mr. Harlan, I understand that people can change, but my priority is Nora's safety. Given the evidence, her injuries, your history, I'm recommending that she be placed in temporary protective custody until a full investigation can be completed. The words hit Garrett like a physical force. Colleen saw it, saw the way his body absorbed the impact, the way his center of gravity shifted as if the floor had tilted beneath him. No. The word came out low and dangerous, not a shout, worse than a shout, a sound that came from the deepest part of a man who had built his entire existence around a single purpose and was now watching that purpose be threatened by someone with a tablet and a title. You are not taking my daughter. Mr. Harlan, I understand this is difficult. You don't understand anything. His voice rose now, and heads turned at the nurse's station. Colleen took a step closer, positioning herself where she could intervene if needed. You walk in here with your fuzz and your reports, and you think you know who I am. You don't know the first thing about me or my daughter. Pritchard's expression remained unchanged. She had heard versions of this speech before, heard it from people who were guilty, and from people who were innocent, and from people who occupied the gray space between. The speech didn't move her. Evidence moved her. Protocols moved her. The accumulated weight of cases she'd handled over 2 decades moved her. Mr. Harlan, I strongly suggest you cooperate with this investigation. It's the only way to ensure a favorable outcome for you and for Nora. Colleen stepped into the room, not between them, beside them, close enough to be present, professional enough to have a reason. Ms. Pritchard, she said, her voice measured, Mr. Harlan has been cooperative since the moment he arrived. He brought Nora here himself. He hasn't left the building. He's answered every question the medical team has asked. Pritchard's gaze shifted to Colleen, cool, appraising. Nurse Ferris, I appreciate your perspective, but these decisions are made based on established criteria, not on observations from a single shift. The dismissal was clean and professional and absolute. Colleen felt it land, felt the door close, and understood that in this particular arena, her voice had limited currency. She was a nurse. Pritchard was the system. I'll be conducting a full investigation into Mr. Harlan's background and Nora's living conditions, Pritchard said, returning her attention to Garrett. A preliminary hearing will be scheduled within 72 hours. Until then, your access to Nora will be supervised. Any attempt to remove her from this facility will be treated as a criminal matter. She tucked the tablet under her arm, nodded once, turned and walked out of the waiting room, her heels marking time against the floor like a metronome counting down to something Garrett couldn't see but could feel approaching. He stood in the middle of the room, motionless. The fight had drained from his posture, replaced by something worse, something that looked like the beginning of surrender. Colleen watched him from the doorway. She had seen that look before. In the mirror 10 years ago when the world had decided who she was and she had almost believed it. She said nothing. Not yet. There was nothing to say that the moment could hold. She turned and walked back to the nurse's station, carrying with her the image of a man standing alone in a room full of empty chairs with 72 hours between him and the loss of everything that mattered. That evening, as the hospital shifted from the fluorescent urgency of daytime into the amber quiet of night, Colleen walked her rounds with more attention than usual. Not to her patients, though they received her standard care, but to the corridors, to the corners, to the faces that passed through the ER, and the faces that lingered when they shouldn't have. She noticed the first one at 8:47, a man in a dark jacket, no visible injuries, no apparent reason to be standing near the vending machines on the third floor. He was looking at his phone, but his eyes moved in a pattern that had nothing to do with a screen. They swept the hallway, paused at the nurse's station, moved to the room numbers posted above each door. He was looking for someone. Colleen kept walking, made a mental note, filed it alongside the other mental notes she'd been accumulating since midnight. She noticed the second one 11 minutes later. Different man, different jacket, same energy. Standing near the elevator bank on the second floor, leaning against the wall with the studied casualness of someone who wanted to look like he belonged, but didn't. His boots were heavy, work boots or riding boots. And on his left wrist, partially covered by his sleeve, a tattoo that Colleen recognized from the patches on Garrett's vest. She didn't stop, didn't stare, continued her rounds with the unhurried pace of a nurse on a quiet shift. But her pulse had picked up, and the part of her brain that had spent 15 years learning to read rooms and people and situations was sending signals that she couldn't ignore. She found Garrett in the small alcove near the stairwell, tucked into a corner where the security cameras didn't quite reach. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his phone in his hand. The screen was dark, but he was staring at it the way people stare at things that have just changed the shape of their world. His face was gray, not the gray of exhaustion which she'd seen on him all day. A different gray, the gray of a man who has just received information that confirms his worst fears. Mr. Harlan, Colleen says, stopping a few feet away. He looked up. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize where he was. Then his eyes focused, and the mask reassembled itself, the tough exterior, the clenched jaw, the locked-down expression that kept the world at arm's length. "I'm fine," he said, the most unconvincing two words in the English language. Colleen didn't challenge the lie. She had something more pressing. "There are men in this building who don't belong here," she said quietly. "Two of them that I've seen. They're watching the hallways. One of them has ink that matches yours." Garrett's reaction was immediate and involuntary. His whole body tensed, a coiling of muscle and instinct that transformed him in the space of a heartbeat from a tired father into something older and more dangerous. The man he used to be surfacing through the cracks of the man he was trying to become. "Where?" he said, not a question, a demand. "Third floor near the vending machines. Second floor by the elevators." They'd been circling for at least 20 minutes. Garrett was on his feet. He looked down the stairwell, then back at Colleen, and she saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. Fight or flight, confront or evade. The old instincts warring with the new ones. "My brother," he said. The words came out like something toxic he was spitting from his mouth. "Boone, he called me 20 minutes ago." He stopped, struggled with something. The muscles in his jaw worked, tendons standing out along his neck like bridge cables under strain. Colleen waited. She had learned over 15 years of working with people in crisis that silence was sometimes more useful than questions, that the spaces between words were where the truth lived. "He knows Nora's here," Garrett said. "He wants me back in the club. Says I owe them. Debts from the old days. 8 years of silence doesn't erase what you owe, that's what he said." He paused. His hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles went white and the plastic casing creaked under the pressure. "He threatened her, Colleen, not in so many words, but I know how he talks. I know the way he wraps a threat in a question, the way he makes it sound like concern. He said hospitals are dangerous places, said accidents happen, said he'd hate for anything to happen to his favorite niece." The words sat in the stairwell like poison. Colleen felt their weight, felt the specific calibrated menace of a man who knew exactly how to deliver a threat without saying anything that could be used against him in court. "He's not bluffing," Garrett continued. "Boone doesn't bluff. He's patient. He waits. And when he moves in ways you don't see coming until it's too late." He looked at Colleen, and in his eyes she saw something she recognized. The exhaustion of a man fighting a war on two fronts. "On one side, I've got CPS trying to take Nora because they think I'm hurting her. On the other side, I've got my own brother threatening to hurt her because I won't go back to hurting other people. And she's lying in that room and I can't protect her from either one. The use of her first name registered. He'd been calling her Nurse Ferris until now. The shift was involuntary, she could tell. A crack in the formality that separated them caused by a fear so large it had knocked the politeness out of him. "Have you told security?" she asked. A bitter sound escaped his throat. Not quite a laugh. "And say what my brother, who's in a motorcycle gang, sent guys to watch the hospital where my daughter is, the daughter they already think I'm beating. That'll help my case with CPS." He was right. Colleen knew he was right, and the knowing sat in her stomach like a stone. The system that was supposed to protect Nora was the same system that made it impossible for Garrett to report the actual threat to her safety. The irony was so sharp it could cut. "You need to tell someone," she said. "I just told you." The words hung between them in the dim stairwell. Above them, fluorescent lights buzzed. Below them, the hospital hummed with its nighttime rhythms. And around them, somewhere in these corridors, men with matching tattoos were watching and waiting for a signal from a brother who didn't forgive and didn't forget. Colleen looked at Garrett Harlan, at the fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with the system or the social worker or the x-rays. This was a different kind of fear. Older, more primal. The fear of a man who knows that violence is coming and that the only person standing between it and his daughter is himself. "Go back to the waiting room," she said. "Stay where the cameras can see you. I'll keep an eye on the hallways. You don't have to do this." "I know." She turned and walked back toward the nurse's station. Her heart was beating faster than her pace suggested. She picked up Nora's chart, made a note about checking vitals, and began her rounds with a detour that took her past the third-floor vending machines in the second-floor elevator bank. Both men were gone, but the feeling they'd left behind remained lingering in the corridors like the smell of smoke after a fire. Something was here that didn't belong. Something that had followed Garrett Harlan through the doors of this hospital and was patient enough to wait. Colleen completed her rounds, checked on Nora, who was still sleeping, her vital signs steady, her small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator. Adjusted her IV, noted the time. Then she went back to the nurse's station, sat down and pulled up Nora's complete medical file on the computer screen. She'd been through it twice already during her shift. The x-rays, the trauma assessment, the notes from Dr. Linden. But she hadn't been looking for what she was looking for now. Now she was looking at the injuries with different eyes. Not the eyes of a nurse performing triage, the eyes of a woman who had spent 15 years learning to read the stories that bodies tell. Stories that don't always match the narratives that people, even well-meaning people, impose upon them. She pulled up the x-ray images, studied the fractures, old and new, that had triggered this entire investigation. The ones that had made Dr. Linden reach for the phone and Pritchard reach for her tablet. Then she pulled up the bruise mapping that the trauma team had documented during intake. Location, size, color, stage of healing. The clinical language reduced each mark on Nora's body to data points on a chart. But data points had patterns, and patterns told stories. A voice behind her made her turn. "You see it too." It was Margot, the night shift nurse who'd been working the trauma room when Nora was brought in. She was standing behind Colleen, reading the screen over her shoulder, her arms crossed over her chest. "See what?" Colleen asked, though she already knew. Margot pulled a chair close and sat down. She pointed to the bruise map on the screen. "Look at the placement. The ones on the forearms here and here, the ones on the shins, the pattern." Colleen looked. She'd noticed it on her second pass through the records, a nagging inconsistency that hadn't fully formed into a thought. Now, with Margot pointing at it, the thought crystallized. "They're in accessible locations," Colleen said slowly. "Arms, shins, upper thighs, places a child can reach on their own body. And the older fractures." Margot tapped the x-ray image. "The wrist, the fingers, the ribs, yes, those could go either way, but the wrist and fingers look at the angle of the breaks." Colleen looked, and she felt something cold move through her chest. "These aren't impact fractures," she said. "They're stress fractures. Repetitive force, not blunt trauma. Someone hitting a child leaves a different signature. This looks like pressure applied over time, applied by small hands." Margot nodded. Her face was grave. "I've seen this pattern before. Twice in my career. Both times it was self-inflicted. Once in a 12-year-old, once in a 9-year-old. Both kids had been through significant loss. Both kids were hiding it from the people closest to them. The word landed in the quiet nurse's station like a stone dropped into deep water. Self-inflicted. An 8-year-old girl with butterfly patches on her jacket and her mother's eyes hurting herself. Deliberately, repeatedly, in ways that left marks she knew how to hide. In ways that looked to a trauma team trained to spot abuse exactly like the thing they were trained to find. The cruelty of it struck Colleen like a fist. Not just the suffering of a child in pain, but the way that pain had been misread, translated by a well-meaning system into an accusation that was destroying the only stable thing in Nora's life. The fractures were real, the bruises were real, but the story everyone was telling about them might be entirely wrong. We don't know that for certain, Colleen said because she had to say it, because jumping to conclusions in either direction was dangerous, because the difference between suspecting and knowing was the difference between helping and harming. No, Margot agreed, we don't. But somebody needs to look at this with fresh eyes. Somebody who isn't already convinced they know the answer. Margot patted Colleen on the shoulder and walked back toward the trauma wing. Her shoes squeaked softly against the floor, and then she was gone and Colleen was alone with the images on the screen and the thought that was forming in her mind like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Slowly, irrevocably, changing the picture of everything she thought she understood about this case. She sat there for a long time, looking at the bruise map, looking at the x-rays, looking at the pattern that was and wasn't what everyone assumed it was. Then she closed the file, stood up, and went to find Garrett. He was in the family waiting room, same chair, same posture, but something in him had changed since Boone's call, a coiled tension that hadn't been there before, the tension of a man who knows that the threats have moved from theoretical to operational, that the danger isn't somewhere out there anymore. It's here, in this building, walking these hallways. Colleen sat across from him, same distance as before. Professional, measured. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to hear it without reacting the way I think you're going to react. Garrett's eyes focused on her, sharp, alert, the eyes of a man who has been conditioned by years of hard living to expect bad news and process it quickly. Some of Nora's injuries, Colleen began choosing each word with the care of someone diffusing a device, are not consistent with abuse. The pattern, the placement, the type of fractures, they're more consistent with self-harm. She watched the words reach him, watched them travel from his ears to his brain to his heart, watched the understanding form and the color drain from his face in a wave that moved from his forehead to his jaw. No, the word was barely audible, a whisper wrapped in denial. She wouldn't. She's 8 years old. She's a kid. She's my kid. Children can and do hurt themselves, Mr. Harlan, especially children who've experienced significant trauma, loss of a parent, instability, feelings they don't have the tools to express any other way. Garrett stood up. The chair scraped backward against the floor. He paced to the window, then back, then to the window again. His hands went to his head, fingers digging into his scalp. The leather vest creaked with each movement, the chains on his jeans marking time, like a metronome set to panic. I would have known, he said, and his voice broke on the word known, shattered like glass on concrete. I'm with her every day. I feed her, I dress her, I check on her at night. I would have seen it. I would have noticed. Colleen said nothing, because the truth was that he might not have noticed. The truth was that children who hurt themselves learn to hide it with a sophistication that would surprise most adults. Long sleeves in summer, stories about playground falls. The casual practice lie of a child who has learned that some pains are private. This changes things, Colleen said. If the investigation can be directed toward understanding what Nora's been going through, rather than assuming you caused it, the outcome could be very different. Garrett stopped pacing, turned to face her. His eyes were wet, but the tears didn't fall. They stood in his eyes like water behind a dam held back by the last remnants of a control that was rapidly eroding. You're saying my little girl has been hurting herself and I didn't see it. I'm saying it's a possibility that needs to be investigated, properly, by someone who knows what to look for. All this time, his voice was barely there now, a ghost of the thunder that had shaken the ER when he'd burst through those doors hours ago. All this time, I thought I was protecting her, thought I was doing the right thing, and she was suffering right in front of me. He sank back into the chair. Not sitting, collapsing. the way a building collapses when the foundation gives out. His massive frame folded in on itself, elbows on knees, head in hands, and for the first time since she'd met him, Colleen saw Garrett Harlan without any armor at all. Not the leather vest, not the tough exterior, not the clenched jaw or the squared shoulders or the dangerous voice. Just a father, a broken, terrified father who had just learned that the enemy he couldn't fight was the one living inside his own daughter's pain. Colleen sat with him, not touching, not speaking, just present, because sometimes presence is the only medicine that works. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The monitors beeped their distant rhythms. And in the quiet space between two people who were both familiar with the geography of rock bottom, something unspoken passed. Not comfort, not reassurance, just a simple, stubborn acknowledgement that they were here in this and that neither of them was walking away. 3 hours later, the system made its move. Pritchard returned at 11:15, flanked not by security guards this time, but by a woman from the hospital's legal department and a man in a state trooper's uniform who stayed near the elevator and tried to look like he wasn't there for a specific reason. Colleen was at the nurse's station when she saw them coming. Her stomach tightened. She paged Dr. Linden, then moved toward Nora's room where Garrett had been sitting for the past 2 hours holding his daughter's hand through the bed railing, talking to her in a low, steady voice about sunflowers and butterflies and a stuffed bear named Captain Buttons. She reached the room just ahead of Pritchard. "Mr. Harlan," Pritchard said from the doorway. Her voice carried the particular gravity of someone about to deliver a decision that has already been made and cannot be unmade by argument or appeal. "I need to speak with you regarding Nora's custody situation." Garrett didn't look up immediately. He finished the sentence he was saying to Nora, something about planting sunflowers in the spring, and then he gently released her hand, stood, and turned to face Pritchard with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who knows what's coming and has decided to meet it standing. "Based on the evidence gathered during our preliminary investigation," Pritchard said, reading from a document on her tablet, "including the nature and history of Nora's injuries, your criminal background, and concerns about the stability of her home environment, I have authorized a temporary protective custody order. Once Nora is medically cleared for transfer, she will be moved to a state-supervised facility pending a full custody review." The room contracted. The air went out of it, pulled through the door and down the corridor and out into the night, leaving nothing but the sound of the monitor and Pritchard's words hanging in the space where oxygen used to be. "You can't do this." Garrett's voice was thick with something that lived beyond anger, something that lived in the marrow of his bones, in the part of him that was built for one purpose and one purpose only. "She needs me. I'm her father. I'm all she has. The decision has been made, Mr. Harlan. You'll have the opportunity to contest it at the hearing." "She'll be scared." His voice cracked, and the crack ran through the room like a fissure in the earth. "If she wakes up and I'm not here, she'll be terrified. She doesn't know anyone else. She doesn't trust anyone else." Pritchard's face remained professional, but Colleen, watching from the side of the room, saw something flicker behind the woman's eyes. A micro-expression that lasted less than a second. Doubt, maybe, or discomfort. The tiny human cost of doing a job that required you to stand in rooms like this and say things like this to people who looked the way Garrett looked right now. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harlan. The order stands." Pritchard turned and left. The woman from legal followed. The state trooper near the elevator shifted his weight and checked his phone. Garrett stood beside Nora's bed. He looked down at his daughter, at her small face, still bruised, still healing, at her hand, which he'd been holding a moment ago, at the IV line and the monitor wires and all the machinery that was keeping her alive and healing in a world that seemed determined to tear her away from the only person who loved her. Colleen saw the decision form in his eyes before he moved. She recognized it because she'd seen it before. Not in bikers or criminals or desperate men, in parents. In the eyes of every parent who has ever been told that their child will be taken and who has looked at their child sleeping and made the calculation that no bureaucratic process, no 72-hour hearing, no system, however well-intentioned, can outweigh the primal imperative to protect what is yours. "Garrett," she said, using his first name deliberately now, because formality was useless in the face of what was about to happen. "Don't." He looked at her, and she saw that he was already gone. Already past the point where words could reach him, the decision had been made in the space between heartbeats, in the gap between Pritchard's heels clicking away and the silence that followed. Boone's guys are in this building, he said. His voice was flat, emptied of everything except purpose. The minute they move her to a state facility, she's outside my reach and inside his. He knows people. He has connections in the system, in group homes, in foster networks. He told me that himself. He said he'd make sure I never saw her again. If you take her now, you'll be a fugitive. You'll lose her permanently. If I leave her here, I'll lose her anyway. He moved, not fast, deliberate, with the gentle precision of a man who has handled fragile things his entire life, engines and carburetors, and the hearts of people who depend on him. He disconnected the IV with a steady hand. The monitor began to beep in protest its alarm, a sharp, insistent sound that would bring nurses running within 60 seconds. He gathered Nora in his arms, wrapped his leather jacket around her small body, cradled her against his chest the same way he'd carried her through the ER doors hours ago. Her head settled against his shoulder. She made a small sound, not awake, not asleep, somewhere in the twilight between. "Garrett," Colleen's voice cracked. "Please." He looked at her, one last look, and in it was everything: gratitude, apology, desperation, and the terrible clarity of a man who has run out of options and is choosing the one that lets him sleep at night, even if it means he never sleeps in the same place twice. "I'm her father," he said. "This is what fathers do." He turned toward the door. The alarm was shrieking now. Footsteps pounded in the corridor, voices shouted. The hospital's immune system was activating, sending white blood cells of security guards and charge nurses toward the source of the disruption. Colleen's hand moved to the nurse call button. Her fingers touched it, pressed it. The right thing to do. The professional thing. The thing that protocol demanded and training required, and every policy manual in every hospital in the country would support. And then she did the other thing. She moved to the doorway, looked down the corridor, saw the security guards coming from the left, saw the clear path to the right toward the service corridor that led to the loading dock. "Right," she said, one word, quiet, aimed at Garrett like an arrow. "Go right." He went right. His boots hammered against the linoleum, each step carrying him and Nora further from the system and closer to the unknown. A storage room. A service corridor that smelled of bleach. An emergency exit that nobody monitored at night because deliveries only came during the day. Colleen stood in the doorway of Nora's empty room. The monitor screamed its flat alarm. The IV line dripped onto the floor. Security guards reached her, breathing hard, asking questions. She answered honestly because lying wasn't something she was built for. "Which way did he go?" She pointed left. She had never lied about a direction in her life. She had never subverted a security response or aided in the removal of a patient from medical care. She had never crossed the line between being a witness and being a participant. She had crossed it now. They would figure out the truth eventually. The security cameras would show the direction Garrett actually went. It would buy him minutes, not hours. But sometimes minutes were enough. Colleen stood in the empty room, listening to the alarm, feeling the weight of what she'd just done settle onto her shoulders like a coat she could never take off. Then she reached for her car keys. She found them at the loading dock. Garrett was standing beside the concrete ramp, Nora in his arms, looking at the parking lot with the focused intensity of a man mapping escape routes in real time. His motorcycle was parked in the far corner. He was calculating. She could see it. "You can't take her on that," Colleen said, and her voice was steady even though her hands weren't. Garrett looked at the motorcycle, looked at Nora. The calculation collapsed. Colleen held out her keys. A simple gesture. A car key on a plain metal ring. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Just a woman holding out a set of keys to a man holding a child in a loading dock that smelled of diesel and concrete at 11:40 on a Tuesday night. "Sedan, silver, second row near the dumpster." She paused. "Bring it back." He took the keys. Their fingers didn't touch. He looked at her, and something passed between them that neither of them would ever be able to name. Then he walked to the car, settled Nora in the back seat, arranged his jacket around her, started the engine. The headlights swept across the loading dock as he pulled away. For a moment, Colleen was caught in the beam, standing alone on the concrete in her wrinkled scrubs, watching the taillights disappear around the corner of the building. Then the light was gone, and she was standing in the dark. She didn't know where he would go. She didn't know what he would do. But she knew with the certainty that comes not from logic, but from reading people for a decade and a half, that somewhere between now and morning, Garrett Harlan would do what he always did. He would face the thing that threatened his daughter. Not with lawyers, not with paperwork. The only way he knew how. And somewhere in the city, in an abandoned warehouse or a shuttered diner, or whatever place brothers who shared blood but not loyalty met to settle debts, he would stand in front of Boone Harlan and make it clear that the past was dead, that the only thing alive in his world was an 8-year-old girl who needed her father to be better than what he'd been. Colleen didn't know the details. She would never know all of them, but she knew the shape of what was happening out there in the dark while she stood here in the light. A man was drawing a line between who he was and who he used to be, between his daughter's future and his brother's demands, between the man who wore the vest and the man who wore it only because he couldn't yet figure out who he was without it. She went back inside, walked through the service corridor, returned to the nurse's station, sat down, picked up a chart, made a notation about a patient in room 7 who needed a medication adjustment at midnight. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the desk until they stopped. Then they started again. She pressed harder. What she had done would have consequences. She knew this the way she knew the periodic table of medications and the protocols for cardiac arrest and the exact number of steps from the nurse's station to trauma room 2. She had aided in the unauthorized removal of a minor patient from medical care. She had misdirected hospital security. She had provided her personal vehicle to a man under active investigation by Child Protective Services. Any one of these things could cost her the nursing license she'd spent 7 years earning. The license that had been her lifeline, her proof of transformation, the tangible evidence that she was more than the worst thing she'd ever done. Ruthie's words made real, made professional, made permanent. Or not permanent, as it turned out, as permanent as the next decision, which was exactly as permanent as she'd just made it. She thought about Nora, about the bruise map on the screen, about the fractures that told a story nobody was listening to because they were too busy telling a different one, about an 8-year-old girl who was hurting herself in silence while the adults around her argued about who was to blame. She thought about Garrett, about the way he'd held his daughter in the ER, about the photograph in his vest pocket, about the tattoo of a small heart with Nora's name on his neck, placed where the world could see it, where he could never hide it, as if he'd wanted to brand himself with the one thing that defined him more than all the other ink combined. She thought about Boone, about the men in the hallways, about the threat that lived outside the hospital's walls and didn't care about protocols or hearings or 72-hour windows. And she thought about herself. 10 years ago, room 14, waking up to a world that had already decided who she was. And one nurse, one person who had decided differently. The clock read 11:52. In 8 minutes, her shift would change. In 8 minutes, someone else would be responsible for the chaos that was about to unfold when the security team realized which direction Garrett had actually gone. In 8 minutes, the question of what she had done and why she had done it would begin to take shape, and she would have to answer it. Not to the hospital, not to CPS, not to the police. To herself, she looked through the window at the empty waiting room, at the plastic chair where Garrett had sat for hours, still slightly pushed back from where he'd stood for the last time, at the crushed coffee cup in the trash can, at the faint scuff marks on the linoleum where his boots had paced. He would come back. She was as certain of this as she was of anything in her life. A man who had spent 8 years building a new identity for his daughter, who had endured the judgment of strangers and the threats of his own blood, who had sat in that chair all night with his hands trembling and his eyes locked on the door behind which his daughter lay, that man was not going to disappear. He was not going to become a story people told about a biker who kidnapped his kid and vanished into the night. That was not who Garrett Harlan was. Not anymore. He was going to do what he needed to do, settle what needed settling, draw the line he needed to draw. And then he was going to bring Nora back because running wasn't protecting. And Garrett Harlan, underneath the vest and the tattoos and the past that clung to him like smoke, understood that better than anyone. He had promised Jesse. He had promised Nora. And Colleen had spent enough time with broken people to know the difference between a man who makes promises and a man who keeps them. Colleen picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway, and she waited. He came back at 4:17 in the morning. Colleen was standing at the nurse's station pretending to review a chart she'd already read 3 times when the sound reached her. Not the roar of a motorcycle. The quiet purr of her own sedan pulling into the hospital's front entrance with the slow, deliberate care of someone who was done running, done hiding, done being anything other than exactly where he needed to be. She set down the chart and walked to the window. The silver car eased into the emergency lane and stopped. The engine cut. For a long moment, nothing happened. The car sat beneath the harsh white glow of the entrance lights, its windshield reflecting the hospital's facade like a dark mirror. A security guard near the entrance noticed the car and started walking toward it, one hand on his radio. Then the driver's door opened and Garrett Harlan stepped out. He looked different, not in any way that a photograph could capture, but in the way that a person who has passed through something looks different from the person who entered it. His leather vest was torn at the left shoulder, the fabric separating along the seam where a patch had been stitched for years. His knuckles were split and swollen, the skin broken across 3 fingers of his right hand, blood dried to a dark crust in the creases. A bruise was forming along his jaw, darkening the skin beneath his beard in a bloom of purple that would take days to fade. But his eyes were clear, clearer than Colleen had seen them since the moment he'd crashed through the ER doors with Nora in his arms. Whatever storm had been raging behind those eyes, whatever war had been fought between the man he was and the man he used to be, it had been decided. The result was written in his posture, in the way his shoulders sat, not slumped with defeat, not squared with aggression, but level, settled. The posture of a man who had drawn his line and was standing on the right side of it. He opened the rear door and lifted Nora out. She was still sleeping, wrapped in his jacket, her head finding its familiar place against his shoulder. He held her the way he'd held her the first time Colleen saw them, cradled, protected, as if his arms were the safest place in the world, and maybe they were. He walked through the automatic doors. The night receptionist looked up, saw the leather vest, saw the sleeping child, saw the blood on his knuckles, and reached for the phone. Colleen was already moving, intercepting the call with a raised hand and a look that said, "I've got this." Garrett stopped in the middle of the ER lobby. He looked at Colleen. She looked at him. "Told you I'd bring it back," he said. His voice was rough, scraped raw, but there was something in it that hadn't been there before. Something that sounded improbably like peace. He held out her car keys. She took them. This time their fingers brushed. Neither acknowledged it. "She needs to be back in her room," Colleen said. "The IV, the monitors. She needs medical care, Garrett." "I know." He looked down at Nora. "That's why I'm here." Colleen led them through the corridors, quietly, efficiently. The night shift was skeleton crew, and most of them were occupied with patients in the East Wing. She guided Garrett back to Nora's room, which had been cleaned and reset since the alarm. New sheets, new IV setup, the monitors dark and waiting. Garrett laid Nora on the bed with the same impossible tenderness he always showed. Arranged the blankets, brushed a curl from her forehead. Stepped back so Colleen could reconnect the IV and restart the monitors. The machines came alive. Green lines traced their steady patterns across the screens. The beeping resumed, that constant, rhythmic sound that meant life was being measured and found sufficient. "What happened out there?" Colleen asked, not looking up from the IV she was adjusting. A pause, long enough for the monitor to beep 6 times. "I told my brother what I should have told him 5 years ago," Garrett said. "That I'm done. That the man he knew is dead. That if he comes near Nora again, the consequences won't be legal. They'll be final." Another pause. Colleen finished with the IV and turned to face him. "He believed me," Garrett said simply. "This time he believed me." He looked at his broken knuckles, flexed his fingers, slowly wincing at the pain. Then he looked at Colleen. "You were right. Running doesn't protect anyone. It just makes the running the whole story." He sat down in the chair beside Nora's bed. The same chair, the same position, but a different man sitting in it. "I'm done running. Whatever happens with CPS, with the investigation, with all of it, I'm here. I'm not leaving." Colleen nodded. She wanted to say more. Wanted to tell him about the bruise map and the fracture patterns in the conversation with Margot. Wanted to tell him that the fight wasn't over, but the battlefield was shifting. But the exhaustion on his face was total. And the clock on the wall read 4:32, and some truths could wait for daylight. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll be at the station." She turned off the overhead light, leaving only the soft glow of the monitors. In the doorway, she paused and looked back. Garrett was already leaning forward in the chair, his hand resting on Nora's bed rail, his fingers close enough to touch hers without quite reaching. He was asleep before Colleen reached the nurse's station. Morning came the way mornings come in hospitals, not with sunrise or birdsong, but with shift changes and clipboard handoffs and the squeak of fresh shoes replacing tired ones. Colleen's replacement, a young nurse named Beth, arrived at 6 with a thermos of tea and the particular cheerfulness of someone who hadn't been awake for 22 hours. Colleen should have gone home. Her shift had ended hours ago. Her body was running on caffeine and adrenaline and the stubborn refusal to leave a story unfinished. Instead, she sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that was more habit than sustenance, and she made phone calls. The first call was to Dr. Whitmore, head of pediatrics. She'd worked with him for 12 years. He was deliberate cautious, the kind of doctor who based his opinions on evidence rather than assumption. She told him about the bruise map, about the fracture patterns, about Margot's observations. She asked him to review Nora's case with fresh eyes. He listened without interrupting. Then he said he'd be in by 8. The second call was to Sarah Caldwell in the hospital's social work department. Sarah was one of the few people Colleen trusted completely, a woman who'd been doing this work long enough to know that the system got it right most of the time and got it catastrophically wrong just often enough to keep her vigilant. The third call was to Mike Brennan and Jenny Oates, 2 nurses from the pediatric ward who had been on rotation during Nora's stay. Both had interacted with Garrett. Both had observations worth documenting. By 7:30, Colleen had assembled the beginning of something. Not a defense, not an argument, a body of evidence. Observations made by trained professionals who had watched a father with his daughter and had seen something that didn't match the narrative being constructed around them. At 8:15, they gathered in the small conference room on the second floor. Dr. Whitmore sat at the head of the table, Nora's complete medical file spread before him. Sarah Caldwell had brought legal precedent documents. Mike and Jenny sat against the wall, their ID badges hanging from lanyards that they twisted nervously. Colleen stood at the front of the room operating on no sleep and pure conviction. "I know this is unusual," she began. "I know that what I'm asking goes against the current direction of the investigation, but I'm asking you to look at the evidence, not the assumptions, the evidence." Dr. Whitmore had already been studying the x-rays. His reading glasses sat low on his nose and his brow was furrowed in the particular way it furrowed when something didn't add up. "The fracture patterns," he said, slowly tracing the images with his pen. "Nurse Ferris is right. These aren't consistent with adult-inflicted trauma. The force angles, the locations, the bilateral symmetry on the forearms. This looks like repetitive self-injury." Sarah spread documents across the table. "I've pulled Garrett Harlan's complete history. Criminal record, yes. Hell's Angels affiliation, yes. But there's been nothing since Nora was born. Not a traffic citation. Not a noise complaint. Nothing. He's been clean for 8 years. I see him on my night shifts," Jenny said, her voice quiet but firm. "He reads to Nora even when she's sleeping. He brought her stuffed bear from home. He knows which arm she prefers for blood draws. He asks about everything, her medications, her test results, her diet. Those aren't the actions of someone who doesn't care." Mike leaned forward. "I was skeptical. I'll admit that. Big guy, scary looking, the whole package. But I've watched him. He knows all her allergies. He knows her favorite foods. He corrected me once when I was about to give her apple juice because she's sensitive to it, and it was in her fault, but I'd missed it." He shrugged. "That's a father who pays attention." Colleen listened to each of them, and something in her chest loosened. Not because they were saying what she wanted to hear, because they were saying what they had independently observed from different angles on different shifts, and it all pointed in the same direction. "The question isn't whether Nora has been injured," Dr. Whitmore said, removing his glasses and setting them on the file. "She clearly has been. The question is whether the narrative we've been building around those injuries is accurate, and based on what I'm seeing, I don't believe it is." He looked at Colleen. "I'll write a formal letter. I'll recommend that the investigation be redirected toward understanding the root cause of Nora's self-harm rather than pursuing an abuse case against her father. And I'll prepare the legal documentation," Sarah added. There's solid precedent for reformed individuals maintaining custody. We just need to build the case properly. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Tasks were divided. Timelines were set. Jenny would document every father-daughter interaction she observed during her shifts. Mike would compile Nora's medical records showing consistent care over the years. Sarah would handle the legal framework. Dr. Whitmore would lead the medical reassessment. When it was over, Colleen found Garrett in Nora's room. He was awake now, sitting in his chair, dark circles carved under his eyes. He was holding Nora's hand through the bed rail, his thumb moving slowly across her small fingers. "Garrett," she said from the doorway, "come out here." He followed her into the corridor, casting one last look at Nora before stepping through the door. His body was tense, coiled, expecting the next blow. "The hospital is behind you," Colleen said. She watched the words reach him, watched them travel through the layers of exhaustion and fear and doubt that had accumulated over the past 36 hours. Watched them land somewhere deep and detonate quietly. "What?" Dr. Whitmore, Sarah from social work, the nurses on the pediatric ward. "They've reviewed your case. They've watched you with Nora, and they see what I see." She paused. "We're building documentation, character witnesses, medical evidence, everything needed to fight the CPS ruling. You're not alone in this." Garrett's mouth opened, closed, opened again. For a man his size, with his history, with the reputation that his vest and his scars and his brother's name carried, the expression on his face was remarkably simple. It was the expression of a man who has been drowning and has just felt ground beneath his feet. "They believe me. They believe in you," Colleen corrected. "There's a difference about you." He looked away, down the corridor, at the fluorescent lights and the polished floor, and the world of clean lines and quiet routines that had been judging him since he walked through those doors. "Thank you." The words came out rough, broken at the edges, inadequate for what they were trying to carry. He knew it. She knew it. "Don't thank me yet," Colleen said. "We've got work to do." The click of heels announced Karen Pritchard before she turned the corner. But the rhythm was different this time. Slower, less metronomic. The pace of someone approaching a conversation they had been rehearsing in their head, rearranging the words, adjusting the tone, preparing to say something that didn't come easily. She was carrying a thick manila folder. Not her tablet. The tablet was professional distance. The folder was personal involvement. Colleen noticed the difference immediately. Pritchard stopped in front of Nora's room. She looked through the window at the sleeping girl, and something moved across her face that Colleen had not seen there before. Not the clinical assessment, not the professional neutrality. Something softer. Something that might have been doubt, or might have been the first crack in a certainty that had been holding her upright since she walked into this case. "Nurse Ferris," she said, "and Mr. Harlan, I need to speak with both of you." They moved to the consultation room down the hall. Pritchard closed the door, laid the folder on the table, stood for a moment with her hands on the back of a chair as if gathering herself. Then she sat down and opened the folder. "I've been conducting a deeper investigation into the circumstances surrounding Nora's case," she began. Her voice had lost its edge, not softened exactly, but stripped of the armor that had made it so impenetrable before. "Not just your history, Mr. Harlan, the broader picture." She pulled out documents, police reports, surveillance photographs, FBI case file summaries with redacted sections that still conveyed enough to paint a picture in broad, damning strokes. "Your brother Boone Harlan is under active federal investigation. Extortion, narcotics distribution, racketeering, 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon currently pending." She pushed a photograph across the table. Boone captured by a long-range lens in a parking lot somewhere, meeting with men whose faces were circled in red ink. "My contacts in law enforcement shared this with me after I made inquiries. He's not just a threat to the community. He's been specifically targeting you and Nora. There are recorded communications that suggest he planned to use your custody case as leverage to force you back into the organization." She set down another document, a timeline meticulously assembled showing the correlation between Boone's recent activities and the escalation of threats against Garrett. The dates lined up like dominoes. "He knew exactly when Nora was admitted," Pritchard said. "He had people inside this hospital within hours, And the pressure he put on you was designed to create exactly the situation we're in now. A desperate father making desperate choices that would justify removing his daughter from his care. The room was very quiet. Colleen could hear the air conditioning cycling, could hear the distant pulse of the hospital going about its business on the other side of the door. Garrett stared at the photograph. His jaw was tight, but his eyes weren't surprised. He'd known what his brother was, had always known. The documentation only made official what had lived in his gut for years. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Harlan," Pritchard said. The words landed in the room like something heavy and unexpected. Colleen held her breath. "I judged you on your record, on your appearance, on the statistical likelihood that a man with your background was responsible for his daughter's injuries." Pritchard's voice was steady, but her hands resting on the folder were not entirely still. "I was wrong. The evidence now suggests that you left a dangerous life to protect your daughter and that your brother has been retaliating against you for that decision." "So now what?" Garrett's voice was careful, not hostile, not grateful. The voice of a man who has been burned too many times to accept warmth without testing it first. "Now we work together," Pritchard said. "I need you to cooperate with the federal investigation into Boone. Everything you know, his operations, his contacts, his methods. In exchange, I will personally advocate for your continued custody of Nora and ensure that both of you receive protection during the investigation." She looked at him directly, without the tablet between them, without the shield of procedure and protocol. "You have my word, Mr. Harlan." Garrett looked at Colleen. She gave him the smallest nod, not telling him what to do, acknowledging that the choice was his and that she'd stand by whatever he decided. He turned back to Pritchard, sat in silence for 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. Then he leaned forward, placed his scarred, broken-knuckled hands on the table, and began to talk. Nora opened her eyes on a Thursday afternoon. The autumn sun had found a gap in the clouds and was sending a beam of warm light through the half-drawn blinds, painting golden stripes across the hospital bed. It was the kind of light that makes a room feel less like an institution and more like a place where good things might happen. Colleen was checking vitals when she noticed the change. Not the monitors, which would catch up in a moment. Something subtler, a shift in the quality of presence in the room. The difference between a body that is sleeping and a body that is waking. A nurse learns to feel it the way a mother learns to feel it, through some sense that has no name, but is as reliable as any machine. Nora's fingers moved first. A small twitch against the hospital blanket. Then her eyelids. A flutter delicate as butterfly wings, the unconscious testing of a system coming back online after a long absence. "Nora," Colleen said softly, leaning closer. "Can you hear me, sweetheart?" The girl's eyes moved beneath their lids, opened a fraction, closed again against the light, opened once more wider this time and found Colleen's face. Confusion first. The disorientation of waking in an unfamiliar place surrounded by unfamiliar sounds with an unfamiliar woman leaning over you. Colleen stepped back, moved to the door, opened it. Garrett was in the hallway as he always was, sitting pacing again. He looked up at the sound of the door and saw Colleen's face, saw what was written there. He was through the door before she'd finished stepping aside. Nora's eyes had wandered the room, taking in the machine, the IV, the white walls. But when her gaze found her father's face, everything else disappeared. The confusion dissolved. The fear receded. Her eyes filled with something that Colleen had seen in many hospital rooms over many years, but that never, no matter how many times she witnessed it, failed to tighten her chest. Recognition, trust, love, complete and unconditional and requiring no explanation. "Daddy," the word was barely a whisper, cracked and dry from days of silence. But it filled the room the way sunlight fills a space when curtains are drawn back. Garrett was beside her in 2 strides. He took her hand carefully, the way he always took it, mindful of the IV, mindful of the bruises, mindful of everything fragile. And then his control, which had held through the accusations and the threats and the fights, and the fear finally broke. He cried, not loudly, not dramatically, the way men of his generation and his world cry in silence, with their shoulders shaking and their teeth clenched and their eyes screwed shut against the tide. Tears ran through his beard and fell onto the hospital blanket, darkening the white fabric in small spreading circles. Nora's hand reached up. Small fingers touched his wet cheek. The gesture was instinctive. A daughter comforting her father as natural as breathing. "Daddy," she said again, "don't cry." He gathered her into his arms, gently, so gently, lifted her from the pillow and held her against his chest, her head fitting into the space beneath his chin, as if it had been designed for exactly this purpose. The monitors adjusted to the movement, their lines fluctuating briefly before settling back into rhythm. Colleen stepped into the corridor and pulled the door closed behind her. She leaned against the wall, pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, took 3 breaths, straightened her scrubs, and walked back to the nurse's station because there were other patients and other charts, and the hospital didn't stop moving just because one small miracle had happened in room 14. Room 14, the same room where she'd woken up 10 years ago. She hadn't realized it until just now. 4 days later, Nora was well enough to talk. The hospital's child psychologist, Dr. Ferris, no relation to Colleen, conducted the session in Nora's room with Colleen present in her capacity as attending nurse. Garrett sat outside the door, close enough to hear through the speaker that Dr. Ferris had set up so he could listen without his presence influencing Nora's responses. Dr. Ferris was patient, gentle. She used drawings and toys and the careful circling questions of someone trained to open doors that children have learned to keep locked. It took 30 minutes before Nora said anything that mattered. "The kids at school," she said. She was drawing with crayons on a pad of paper, her voice flat and matter-of-fact, in the way that children's voices become when they're describing something they've lived with so long it feels ordinary. "They say things." "What kind of things?" Dr. Ferris asked. Nora's crayon stopped moving. "That my dad is a bad man, a criminal, that he hurts people." She looked down at her drawing. "They say my mom died because of him, that she was running away from him, and that's why the car crashed." The crayon pressed harder into the paper. The line thickened, darkened. "Tyler said nobody's parents let them come to my house because my dad is scary. He said my mom would still be alive if my dad wasn't a biker." Dr. Ferris waited. "I tried to tell them it wasn't true." Nora continued. Her voice was smaller now, retreating into the place where she kept the things she couldn't say out loud. "But they wouldn't listen, and then more kids started saying it. Every day, at lunch, at recess, on the bus." She set the crayon down. Her hands moved to her forearms, fingers tracing the places where bruises had been, where fractures had healed crooked, where the evidence of her pain had been cataloged and misinterpreted and used as a weapon against the one person she loved most. "I started thinking maybe they were right," she whispered. "Maybe it was Daddy's fault. Maybe if I wasn't here, he wouldn't be so sad all the time. Maybe I'm the reason everything is hard." Outside the door, Colleen heard a sound, low and ragged and barely human. She turned. Garrett was sitting on the floor of the corridor, his back against the wall, his hands covering his face. His shoulders were shaking. The speaker on the wall beside him carried his daughter's voice into the hallway, each word a blade that found the spaces between his ribs. "So, I started hurting myself," Nora said, and her voice was so small it nearly disappeared. "I thought if I got hurt enough, maybe someone would notice. Or maybe if I hurt myself, the other hurting would stop. I don't know, I just wanted it to stop." Dr. Ferris handed Nora a tissue. The girl took it, but didn't use it. "I hid it from Daddy because I didn't want him to be sad. He's already sad about Mommy. I didn't want to make him sadder. So I wore long sleeves. And when he asked about bruises, I said I fell at school." She looked up at Dr. Ferris with eyes that were too old for her face. 8 years old and already fluent in the language of concealed suffering. "I didn't want to be a problem," she said. "I just wanted to be good." Colleen walked to where Garrett sat on the floor. She didn't speak, didn't touch him, just lowered herself to the linoleum beside him, her scrubs crinkling against the wall, and sat there while his daughter's voice continued through the speaker, telling the truth that had been hiding inside her bones. After a long time, Garrett's hands came down from his face. His eyes were destroyed, red and swollen and empty of everything except a grief so large it had no edges. "I was fighting the whole world to protect her," he said, and his voice was barely there. "And the whole time the thing hurting her was inside her. And she hid it from me because she didn't want to be a burden." He pressed his head back against the wall, stared at the ceiling. "She's 8 years old, Colleen, 8, and she thinks she's a problem." Colleen sat with him, in the silence. in the wreckage, because some moments don't need words, they need witness. Eventually, Dr. Ferris opened the door and nodded. Garrett stood, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and walked into his daughter's room. Colleen watched through the window. He sat on the edge of Nora's bed, took both her hands in his, and he spoke to her with a voice that shook but did not break. You are not a burden. You are not a problem. You are the reason I get up in the morning. You are the reason I changed my life. Everything good that I am, everything good that I will ever be is because of you. Nora's lip trembled. But the kids said, the kids don't know me. They don't know us. They don't know that you taught me how to braid hair by watching videos on my phone at 2 in the morning. They don't know that you made me read Charlotte's Web 6 times because you loved it so much. They don't know that you are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful person I have ever known in my life. He pulled her close, held her against his chest. And Nora cried, not the silent, hidden tears of a child who has learned to suffer alone, but the open, messy, loud tears of a child who has finally been told that it's safe to let go, that someone is here, that someone sees her. Colleen turned from the window and walked back to the nurse's station. She sat down, picked up a chart, set it down, picked up her coffee, set that down too. She cried, quietly at her desk with her back to the corridor so no one would see. Not for Nora, though Nora deserved it every tear. Not for Garrett, though his pain was staggering. For herself. For the woman who had woken up in room 14 10 years ago, alone and broken and convinced she was a burden on everyone who had ever loved her. For the nurse named Ruthie who had sat beside her bed and said, you're more than the worst thing you've ever done. For the fact that she was here, that she had survived, that she had been given the chance to sit beside someone else's wreckage and say without words, you are not alone in this. She wiped her eyes, straightened her scrubs, and went back to work. The weeks that followed moved at the pace of healing, which is to say slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and small victories that accumulated like snowfall. Some days were good, some days were hard enough to make a man wonder if he was built for this. But the days kept coming, and Garrett kept showing up for them, which is all that healing really asks. Garrett attended parenting classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He sat in metal chairs in community center basements, the largest person in the room by a considerable margin, surrounded by young mothers and nervous first-time fathers, and people whose lives looked nothing like his. And he listened. He took notes in a small spiral notebook with handwriting that looked like it had been produced by an earthquake. But the notes were thorough and the questions he asked were the right ones. Questions about communication, about recognizing signs of distress in children, about the difference between protecting a child from danger and creating a space where a child feels safe enough to tell you when danger has already found them. That was the lesson that had broken him open. Not the violence of his past, or the threats of his brother, or the machinery of the state bearing down on his family. The realization that his daughter had been suffering within arm's reach and she hadn't told him because she loved him too much to add to his pain. That was the kind of failure that no amount of physical strength or street fighting skill could address. It required a different kind of courage, the courage to be quiet, to listen, to sit with discomfort instead of punching through it. He started seeing a counselor, not because the court required it, though it did, because Nora was seeing one and he understood in a way he hadn't before that protecting his daughter meant more than standing between her and danger. It meant learning to see the danger that lived inside her silence. He enrolled in a GED program, found one that met in the mornings before his shift at the construction site where a foreman named Hank had given him a chance based on a recommendation from one of the nurses at St. Maron's, Jenny Oates' sister, who ran the office. Hank didn't care about the vest or the tattoos. He cared about whether you showed up on time and whether you could follow instructions and whether you did the work. Garrett did all three. The hospital staff signed a petition supporting Garrett's custody. Every nurse on the pediatric ward, every orderly who had passed by Nora's room and seen the big man reading to the sleeping girl. Dr. Whitmore wrote a formal letter. Sarah Caldwell prepared the legal filing. Colleen's name was the first on the petition. She signed it at the nurse's station at 7 in the morning on a Wednesday, and she didn't hesitate. Nora was discharged on a Saturday. Colleen was on shift. She walked the discharge paperwork to the front desk herself, checked every line, initialed every box. Then she walked to Nora's room one last time. Garrett was helping Nora into her jacket, the denim jacket with the butterfly patches. It had been cleaned and mended, a small tear in the sleeve sewn shut with clumsy, careful stitches that could only have been made by a man whose hands were more accustomed to engine parts than needles. Nora looked up and saw Colleen in the doorway. "Nurse Colleen," she said, and she smiled. Not the guarded, provisional smile of a child who has learned to protect herself. A real smile, full and bright and carrying the specific luminous quality of a child who has been told she is not a problem and is beginning to believe it. Garrett straightened, looked at Colleen. The look lasted 3 seconds and contained more than most conversations manage in an hour. "You saved us," he said. Colleen shook her head. "You saved yourself. I just didn't look away." They nodded at each other, the nod of two people who had been through something together, who understood each other in a way that didn't require explanation or elaboration, and who knew that the connection between them, whatever it was, whatever name it might or might not be given, was built on the solid ground of a shared refusal to accept the easy story when the true one was harder. Colleen watched them walk down the corridor, Garrett's hand on Nora's shoulder. Nora's stuffed bear, Captain Buttons, tucked under her arm, the denim jacket with its butterfly patches catching the light from the windows as they moved. They pushed through the front doors and stepped into the morning sunlight, and the doors swung closed behind them, and they were gone. Colleen stood in the corridor for a moment. 15 years she'd worked in this building. Thousands of patients had walked out those doors. Some healed, some not. Some she remembered. Most she didn't. She would remember these two. She turned, walked back to the nurse's station, and picked up the next chart. There was always a next chart. In a small apartment near a park on the east side of town, Garrett Harlan opened his mailbox one evening and found a plain white envelope with no return address. He knew the handwriting before he'd fully pulled it from the stack. Boone's jagged scrawl pressing hard enough to leave grooves in the paper. He stood in the kitchen. Nora was in her room doing homework, humming a song she'd learned in school. The sound drifted down the short hallway like something carried on a warm breeze. He opened the envelope, unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. 5 words. "The past never truly dies." Garrett read the words, read them again. Then he struck a match, held it to the corner of the paper. Watched the flame crawl upward, consuming the letters one by one. He held the burning paper over the kitchen sink until the last fragment turned to ash and fell. The past might not die, but it didn't get to write the future. Not anymore. He rinsed the ash down the drain, washed his hands, and walked down the hallway to help his daughter with her fractions. Weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, Colleen drove to the county fair. She wasn't looking for anyone. She'd finished a double shift and needed air and noise and the smell of something that wasn't antiseptic. She bought a coffee from a vendor near the entrance, black, no sugar, and she walked through the fairgrounds with no destination in mind. The place was alive with color and sound. Balloons bobbing in the breeze. Children shrieking on rides that spun too fast. The smell of funnel cake and grilled corn drifting through the autumn air. She saw them near the game booths. Garrett was wearing a blue work shirt with a construction company logo embroidered on the pocket. No leather vest, no chains, no patches. Just a man in a clean shirt standing beside a game booth, watching his daughter aim a water pistol at a spinning target. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows. The tattoos were still there, faded ink that would never fully disappear. But they looked different now. Not like warnings, like history, like the rings inside a tree that tell you what it survived. Nora's tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated. Her dark hair was pulled back in neat pigtails. She squeezed the trigger. The stream of water hit its mark, and bells rang as the target spun. Her face erupted in a joy so pure it seemed to generate its own light. "Did you see that, Daddy?" She beamed, hugging the oversized teddy bear the booth operator handed her. "I did it." "Sure did, Princess." Garrett's smile reached his eyes, all the way, crinkling the corners in a way that rearranged his entire face, transforming it from something hard into something warm. They walked through the fair together. Nora rode the carousel 3 times, waving to her father each time the painted horse carried her past. Garrett waved back every single time his hand raised his eyes, never leaving her. At the face painting station, Nora chose butterflies. The artist, a kind woman with paint-stained fingers and a gentle hand, worked carefully to create delicate wings across Nora's cheeks in blue and gold and violet. Nora sat perfectly still during the process, more patient than most adults watching the artist brush in a hand mirrors with the focused attention of someone witnessing a transformation. When it was done, she stood up and spun around to show her father, arms spread wide, face tilted up to catch the autumn sun. The butterflies on her cheeks glowed in the golden light, and for a moment she looked exactly like what she was, a child, a happy child, a child with paint on her face and a teddy bear under her arm, and a father who was watching her with an expression that needed no translation in any language. "Now I can fly," she said. "You sure can, baby." Garrett's voice was rough, but his eyes were clear. He pulled out his phone and took a picture, then another, then one more, because some moments deserved to be captured from every angle. They bought corn dogs from a food truck, found a bench near the exit, sat together and ate and watched the fair spin around them. Families everywhere. Ordinary families doing ordinary things. Nobody gave the man with the tattooed arms and the construction company shirt a second glance. He was just another father at the fair with his kid. Just another dad wiping mustard off his daughter's chin and telling her to finish before she could have ice cream. The ordinariness of it was the whole point. Colleen stood near the coffee vendor 30 yards away watching. She didn't approach, didn't wave, didn't need to insert herself into the scene or claim any part of it. This wasn't her moment. It was theirs. She watched Garrett take a photo of Nora with his phone, the girl posing with her teddy bear and her butterfly face and the kind of smile that only exists when a child feels completely, utterly safe. She watched them buy corn dogs and find a bench and sit together, Nora swinging her legs and talking with her mouth full about something that made Garrett laugh. A real laugh. The kind that comes from a place that has been empty for a long time and is finally cautiously filling back up. She watched Nora reach for her father's hand as they walked toward the exit. Watched the way their hands fit together, her small one, wrapped around two of his large fingers, the way it had always been. Watched the afternoon sunlight catch them both casting long shadows across the grass that stretched out behind them. Two people, one stuffed bear, walking toward a parking lot and a car and an apartment near a park and a life that was ordinary and imperfect and hard-earned and real. Colleen took a sip of her coffee. It was good. Better than the hospitals, certainly, though. That was a low bar. She turned and walked back toward the parking lot. Her car was waiting. Her apartment was waiting. Tomorrow's shift was waiting. There would be other patients, other charts, other midnight emergencies when the doors would fly open and someone would need her to move before she had time to think. And she would move. Because that's what she did. That's who she'd become. Not the woman who'd woken up in room 14 with nothing. The woman who'd been given one chance by one person and had spent every day since trying to be worthy of it. She unlocked her car, slid behind the wheel, started the engine. The fair music drifted faintly through the closed windows, a carousel melody, tinny and sweet, the kind of song that sounds like childhood itself. She thought about Ruthie, about the words that had saved her life, about the chain of small, stubborn acts of faith that connected a nurse in a hospital bed 10 years ago to a nurse in a parking lot today. Ruthie had believed in Colleen when Colleen couldn't believe in herself. Colleen had believed in Garrett when the world couldn't see past his vest. And Garrett, through all of it, had believed in Nora. Had believed that she was worth changing for, worth fighting for, worth becoming someone new for. That was the thing about second chances. They didn't come from systems or institutions or policies. They came from people. From one person deciding to see another person clearly, to look past the easy story to the true one, and to act on what they saw. In the rearview mirror, she could just make out the fairgrounds, bright and noisy against the autumn sky. Somewhere in there, a little girl with butterflies on her cheeks was holding her father's hand and believing for the first time in a long time that she was not a burden, that she was not a problem, that she was someone's whole world. Colleen put the car in gear and pulled out of the lot. The road ahead was clear.